Hello! Today we will be interviewing DeviantD, the writer of Silencio. Enough said. Welcome, DeviantD. How did you discover Worm?
Back when I had copious free time after being made redundant and before finding a new job, I was on a bit of a Mass Effect fic binge. Or an XCOM binge. Either way, I had just finished reading Agiek's XCOM Second Contact and decided to check out his other works. Templar popped up as an option, and I found myself wondering, what the hell's Worm? Quick Google later, and I spent a week or two getting very little sleep as I read through the entirety of it just as it finished. Then I went back, read Templar, then discovered the Wormverse Ideas thread. Cue me not getting anything productive done for quite some time.
Okay. What was your favorite part of Worm?
During reading, I was pretty damn hooked for the entire thing. But with hindsight, it would have to be a coin toss between the pre-Leviathan gang war arc or the later Warlord arc. Probably leaning more towards the post-Leviathan side of it, with Taylor really coming into her own as, well, a warlord. The Slaughterhouse 9 section, though, I still have mixed feelings about that. Basically, the interaction between Taylor and the Undersize is what really drew me into the story.
What was your favorite thing to write?
I think I enjoyed writing The Good Hunter's Journal the most. Being really into Bloodborne at the time, it just seemed to come to me a lot easier than any other writing project, and I've always been one for a bit of black comedy. The more simplistic journal format made for an interesting change, and allowed me to write in short bursts more easily as well. Silencio would be only a minuscule distance behind that. It was made much more enjoyable by the massive fan interaction and the startling amount of omakase. The only reason it falls behind is there were quite a few updates that were like pulling teeth, namely the one that has been sitting half-finished for so long and is most likely going to get scrapped by the time I get around to continuing.
You're most well known for writing Silencio and codifying into the fandom the shipping chart, purity and Gru, and various other things. In your opinion, what's the most interesting impact Silencio's had on the fandom?
I should probably point out first that I can direct much of the blame for those two particular things on Sir Bill and Atlan respectively, as their omakase spawned the ideas in the first place. Blame, credit, one of the two, though I certainly didn't help matters by making the latter canon and supporting the former. I have to say, I lost my shit when I first saw the shipping chart, and I still get a chuckle each time it gets brought up in the strangest and most inappropriate places. As for impact, it may just be a flare-up of my otherwise atrophied ego, but I could have sworn there weren't any romantic comedies in the fandom before Silencio. Of course, now that I've said this, someone will point out one that I've either forgotten or never discovered in the first place, and thus prove me wrong. If not, though, I'd like to think that the higher prevalence of more comedic or fluffy fics in the fandom these days might at least be in part because of Silencio. Some may see this as a negative thing. Hell, I've seen people bitching about there not being enough stories matching the original tone. But frankly, I can use some more happiness in my leisure reading.
Appointment. Yeah. Silencio also had such an odd concept, and it feels more like a Saturday morning cartoon than a piece of writing at times. It's got a certain sense of humor that's not quite cracky randomness, and yet is absurd enough to make things funny. Yet at other times it's sincere and nice and overall just such an enjoyable piece of fiction. Any advice on how to balance these things?
Frankly, I have no idea how I managed as well as I did, given my rather haphazard approach to forward planning. The only thing that I can really offer is to look at a plot point that you are thinking of writing and compare it to what has gone before. Ask yourself, does this feel like it belongs in a different fic? If so, that isn't necessarily a reason to reject it, but it is an indicator that it may need some reworking. This is at least a minor contributor to the hiatus on Silencio. I have a reasonable amount of stuff plotted out that seems to fail this literary litmus test. Of course, I say all this with the full weight of hypocrisy behind me, given the intentional mood backlash that I've been invoking of late.
I remember Enrichment back in the day. It sort of felt like by the end you'd written yourself into a corner and that's why it stopped. Was it that or something else? Commitments became less enjoyable?
Ah yes, Enrichment. That was my first concerted effort at writing fanfiction, or rather, fiction in general. Before that, I'd only really written a few hundred words of Shadowrun stuff. Any other writing tended to be of the scientific report or university essay variety. Given my inexperience, I made a lot of mistakes. From my first attempt, doing a wards member tailor was in hindsight a horrible idea. It really does restrict options if you haven't properly planned around the complications. That, of course, led to trouble thinking of what to happen next when the protagonist's actions are limited by protocol, and thus the corner you mentioned. While I had originally been intending to do more with it, the idea for Silencio popped into my head one day, and it became easier to not put any more thought into enrichment. Mostly, though, I feel that my focus on Taylor's abilities was, well, unfocused. While adding the Aperture Science Tinker ability gave a few cheap laughs, it ended up diluting things. That and I had basically lost any sort of characterization for Taylor, instead having some horrible mismatch of her and GLaDOS in her place. So as much as it may be overly self-critical, I can't help but think of it as the equivalent of an embarrassing set of childhood blunders.
Recently you started up Letting Go, which is an Exalted crossover. In the early days of the fandom, it felt like every second fic was an Exalted crossover, but it feels like no new ones have popped up in a while. What made you pick Exalted?
I had thought of doing a crossover with Exalted back in the early days, but with Silencio running at full steam at the time, and the overabundance of Exalted fics, I put it off. Recently I stumbled across the Thief of Words fic by the name of Infernal Conundrum, and that awoke the sleeping desire to do said crossover. Luckily I managed to finish the Good Hunter's Journal, despite my muse prodding me in the brain with ideas for what would become Letting Go. I've always been intrigued by the Exalted setting. It is, to be blunt, absurd. It is all over the place in terms of themes, power level, and flavour, but despite that, it has some very nifty things that, taken in moderation, are wonderful, or disturbing, often both. I'm not at all interested in reading or writing a full-on Exalted story, but as crossover fodder, I find it fascinating. In particular, the hilarious bullshit that can be done with the various charm trees. And of course, the implications that they have on characters who have access to them, and those that they interact with. This applies doubly to Infernal Exalted and their bizarre selection of magical shenanigans.
What's your favourite fanfiction and why?
Picking any one favourite isn't going to happen. That sort of thing varies by mood to an excessive degree, though generally I prefer the more light-hearted or comedic variety. While there have been a few outright crack fics that I have enjoyed, I prefer the more grounded stories. In other words, amusing but not completely illogical. However, I find that I have an alarming interest in unlikely crossovers, preferably ones that are executed well. On that note, the works of Pangolin, Unwelcome Storm, and Harry Lafertz are some of my most enjoyed ones at the moment, namely Centipede, Constellations, and Harry the Shipgirls, respectively.
Any other recommendations?
Anything I would recommend should be taken with a bucket of salt, given my eclectic tastes. But the mission stays the same by Broken Trident deserves a mention. It isn't complete, and I am hanging out for the next update, but it is a surprisingly well thought out and written piece, given its crossover concept of 40k and Mass Effect. For single setting fiction, I would really recommend Cain and Abel Service in a Shadow by Mike Storm, an underrated Warhammer 40,000 story, following a particularly unlucky junior commissar working under a certain hero of the Imperium. It manages to capture the feel of the original series quite well, while avoiding retreading canon.
Well, thank you very much, DeviantD, and I'll see you guys next week.